Sir, Iraq has weapons of mass Attack them. Sir, 9/11. Attack them. Just attack them. This is America. But how did one country get this powerful? Let's go back to where it all began. Before America was America, it was 13 British colonies sitting on the eastern coast of North America, full of farmers, merchants, adventurers, and people who had looked at Britain and said, you know what, I'd rather start completely over on the other side of the ocean. And for a while, Britain mostly left them alone. The colonists made their own laws, ran their own affairs, and life was decent. Then Britain got into a massive, expensive war with France, the 7 Years' War, and lost an absolute fortune. Britain looked at its colonies and said, you know who should help pay for this war that you didn't fight in and weren't even asked about? You. First came the Stamp Act, then taxes on glass, paper, paint, and tea. The colonists had one very reasonable objection. They had zero representation in British Parliament. No vote, no say, nothing. Britain was just pointing at them from 3,000 miles away going, give us money. The colonists called it taxation without representation. Britain called it, we don't remember asking for your opinion. In 1770, a crowd of colonists in Boston started throwing rocks and ice at British soldiers. The soldiers panicked and fired into the crowd, killing 5 people. The colonists called it the Boston Massacre and plastered it on every newspaper in America. Then in 1773, the tea tax pushed people completely over the edge. A group of colonists disguised themselves as Native Americans, snuck onto British ships in Boston Harbor, and threw 342 chests of British tea directly into the ocean. 342 chests, 90,000 pounds of tea, gone. Britain responded by shutting down Boston's port and stripping Massachusetts of self-governance. The colonists responded by picking up muskets. On April 19, 1775, the first shots of the American Revolutionary War were fired at Lexington and Concord. The Continental Congress chose George Washington to lead the Continental Army. Washington was tall, calm, dignified, and universally respected. His army was not. No proper uniforms, not enough weapons, soldiers deserting constantly against the most powerful professional army in the world. And speaking of that army, Britain was so concerned about fighting the colonists that they hired German soldiers called Hessians to help them. Britain had to rent soldiers to fight farmers with muskets. Okay, Britain, we respect the commitment. Washington lost battle after battle in the early years, but he had one genius quality. He refused to let his army be destroyed. He retreated when he had to, he regrouped, he waited. And on Christmas night, 1776, while the Hessian soldiers were full of Christmas dinner and definitely not expecting anything, Washington loaded his freezing army onto boats, crossed the icy Delaware River in a blizzard, marched 9 miles through the dark, and completely ambushed them. Victory against everything. Then France joined the war on America's side, not because they loved America, but because they absolutely despised Britain. And this was too good an opportunity to miss. With French naval support cutting off British reinforcements, General Cornwallis found himself completely trapped at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781. He surrendered. Britain signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783. America, the most powerful country on planet Earth today, was finally independent. George Washington, the most powerful and respected man in America, was offered the chance to become king. He said no. People asked again. He said no again. And then he went home to his farm. This man was offered to be King of America. King of America. And he said no and went home to his farm. I would not have said no. Would you reject an offer like that? Let me know in the comments. So now America was free. Fantastic. But also, now what? They needed a government. Fast. Their first attempt, the Articles of Confederation, was so weak. It was almost embarrassing. The central government couldn't collect taxes, couldn't enforce laws, and states were basically doing whatever they wanted. So in 1787, America's smartest men gathered in Philadelphia in the summer heat in wool suits and wrote the United States Constitution, a strong federal government with powers split between 3 branches: a president, a Congress, a Supreme Court, each one keeping the others in check, so no single person could ever become too powerful. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. He didn't want the job. job. He took it anyway. He served 2 terms, warned America about political parties and foreign conflicts, and left. America immediately formed political parties and got into foreign conflicts. Wonderful start. Thomas Jefferson became president in 1800. One day, he was just walking down the street when he spotted something unusual. A man with a rolling cart, covered in sale stickers, piled high with maps and land documents. The man on the cart was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon shouted, "Land for sale, best price." Jefferson stopped, looked at the cart. How much? Napoleon, 15 million only, final price, no negotiation. Jefferson thought for exactly 1 second. That's a hell of a deal. This was the biggest real estate deal in human history. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States overnight, 828,000 square miles, for $15 million. Jefferson then sent explorers Lewis and Clark on a 2-year expedition to explore this enormous new territory. They covered 8,000 miles, and they had a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea guiding them for much of it. Without her, they would have died several times over, and everyone knows it. Then came the War of 1812. America declared war on Britain again over trade disputes, British ships kidnapping American sailors, and Britain arming Native American tribes. But midway through fighting Britain, America looked over at Canada and thought, hey, while we're at it, let's just take Canada too. Please. Canada, no. America, please. Canada, no. America, please. Canada said, no. This is Canada, the most polite country that stopped America cold. Meanwhile, the British sailed into Washington, D.C., walked into the White House, sat down, and ate the dinner freshly prepared for President Madison, who had already fled. Then they burned the building down. First Lady Dolly Madison, before escaping, made sure to save a famous portrait of George Washington. Priorities. Eventually, both sides got tired. They signed a peace treaty. Nothing really changed. Both sides declared victory and moved on. America kept pushing westward, driven by the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were destined to spread from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This was great for America, considerably less great for the millions of Native Americans already living on that land. Andrew Jackson became president in 1829. He forced tens of thousands of Native Americans off their ancestral lands at gunpoint. The forced march to Oklahoma became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died of cold, disease, and starvation. It is one of the darkest chapters in American history. America's hunger for land eventually led to war with Mexico in 1846. 2 years later, Mexico was forced to hand over California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and more. America had just gotten enormously bigger. Again. But all this new land was about to cause a catastrophic problem. Now, before we go any further, did you know about Columbus? Here he comes. Screamed, India! India? Nah, America. India? Nah, America. India! Nah, America. He is Columbus. He would still be arguing from heaven. By the way, Columbus sailed to the Americas 4 times. 4 times! And died completely convinced he had reached Asia. The problem with all this new land was simple and terrible. Would the new territories allow slavery? Or not. The southern states had built their entire economy on the forced labor of over 4 million enslaved black Americans, living in conditions of unimaginable brutality, with no rights and no freedom. The northern states had industrialized. They didn't need enslaved labor, and abolitionists were growing louder every year. Every new territory that joined the Union reignited this fight. Congress kept slapping together compromises, but each one just kicked the problem further down the road. Then in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, deeply opposed to the expansion of slavery, won the presidential election. The South panicked. Before Lincoln even took office, 7 southern states had already left the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. And in April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. It would become the deadliest war in American history. The Union had more people, more factories, more railroads, more resources. The Confederacy had better generals and soldiers fighting for their homeland. The early years went badly for the Union. Lincoln went through general after general, desperately searching for someone who could actually win. Then he found Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was not glamorous. Grant was not sophisticated, but Grant would fight. He just kept pushing forward, no matter what, and that relentless pressure pressure, slowly ground the Confederacy down. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate states to be free. It transformed the war from a fight to save the Union into a fight to end slavery, and it opened the door for nearly 200,000 black soldiers to join the Union Army. The war turned at Gettysburg in July 1863. 3 days of brutal fighting in Pennsylvania. Over 50,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in just 3 days. After Gettysburg, the Confederacy was slowly dying, running out of food, men, and hope. On April 9, 1865, General Lee surrendered to Grant. The war was over. Over 620,000 Americans had died. 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer who thought killing Lincoln would somehow save the Confederacy. The Confederacy had already surrendered 5 days ago. 5 days. Buddy, you were a little late. Reconstruction followed, a painful attempt to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into society as free citizens. For a brief moment, Black Americans voted, held office, and built communities. But then the federal government pulled back. Southern states enacted Jim Crow laws, brutal systems of segregation that would oppress Black Americans for nearly another 100 years. The Civil War ended slavery, but the fight for true equality was far from over. After the Civil War, America went through an industrial explosion. Railroads stretched coast to coast, steel mills roared, oil wells gushed, and a handful of men got obscenely rich. John D. Rockefeller controlled 90% of all oil in America. Andrew Carnegie dominated steel. These men were so powerful, they could do almost anything they wanted. Workers, meanwhile, worked 12-hour days in dangerous conditions for almost nothing. Children worked in coal mines. Immigrants poured in from Europe by the millions, desperate for any opportunity. The era got a sarcastic nickname, the Gilded Age. Shiny and golden on the outside, rotten underneath. Theodore Roosevelt became president in 1901 after President McKinley was assassinated, making him the youngest president in American history at just 42. Roosevelt was loud, energetic, and absolutely determined to break up the corporate giants. He protected millions of acres as national parks and regulated industries that had never been regulated before. In 1898, the Spanish-American War lasted only 4 months, but gave America its first overseas territories, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. America was now a global power. In 1914, Europe exploded into the most devastating war the world had ever seen. America watched from across the ocean and said, "Not our problem." President Woodrow Wilson kept America neutral for years. Then, Germany started sinking American ships. Then, Britain intercepted a secret German message, the Zimmermann telegram, proposing that Mexico attack the United States in exchange for help reclaiming Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. America was in. 2 million American soldiers flooded into Europe, giving the exhausted Allied forces the boost they desperately needed. By November 1918, Germany was defeated. The Treaty of Versailles that followed punished Germany so harshly, stripping territory, crushing its military, demanding enormous payments, that it created exactly the bitterness and despair that would fuel the next war. But we'll get to that. Back home, America roared into the 1920s. The economy was booming, jazz filled the air, cars were everywhere, Hollywood was born. And then, in 1920, the government proudly announced, alcohol is now completely banned. The government sat back, feeling very pleased with itself. Al Capone was also watching TV. Al Capone read the news, threw a party, obviously, with alcohol. Great plan. People didn't stop drinking, they just started buying from criminals. Al Capone became one of the most powerful men in America, basically because the government made alcohol illegal. After 13 years, America quietly made alcohol legal again and never spoke of it. Then on October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, the stock market collapsed. Banks failed, businesses closed, unemployment hit 25%. Families lost everything. Millions stood in breadlines. President Herbert Hoover's response was essentially, the economy will fix itself. It did not fix itself. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt, FDR won the presidency in a landslide, promising Americans a New Deal. FDR had contracted polio in 1921 and could barely walk, yet he projected more confidence and optimism than almost any president before or since. He moved fast. In his first 100 days, he launched an avalanche of programs, creating jobs, regulating banks, supporting farmers, building infrastructure, the Hoover Dam, the Golden Gate Bridge. Millions of Americans put back to work. He gave regular radio addresses called fireside chats, speaking directly to ordinary Americans in plain language, telling them things would get better. They believed him. The New Deal didn't fully end the Depression, but it gave America something it desperately needed: hope. Meanwhile, in Europe, a nightmare was taking shape. Adolf Hitler had risen to power in Germany, feeding on the humiliation and economic misery created by the Treaty of Versailles. He built a totalitarian state, scapegoated Jewish people with vicious propaganda, and began a systematic persecution that would eventually become the Holocaust, the genocide of 6 million Jewish people and millions of others. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. World War II had begun. America watched from a distance, deeply reluctant to enter another European war. Then on December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. America declared war on Japan the next day. And then, something completely unexpected happened. Hitler, who had absolutely no obligation to get involved, voluntarily declared war on America. Nobody asked him. Japan hadn't asked him. America certainly hadn't asked him. He just did it. Adolf, buddy, what are you doing? America was now fully in the war on both sides of the world simultaneously. What happened next was extraordinary. America transformed itself almost overnight into the greatest war machine in history. Factories that made cars started making tanks and bombers. Women entered the workforce in massive numbers. The economy that had been limping since the Depression suddenly roared back to life. In Europe, American forces landed in North Africa, then Sicily, then Italy. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, over 150,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest seaborne invasion in history. They pushed across France, liberated Paris, and drove deep into Germany. As Allied forces liberated Nazi concentration camps, the full horror of the Holocaust became undeniable. The world was forever changed. In the Pacific, America fought a brutal island-hopping campaign against Japan. Each island came at horrific cost. President Harry Truman, who had taken over after FDR died in April 1945, just weeks before Germany surrendered, faced an impossible decision. Military planners estimated a land invasion of Japan could cost 1 million American casualties. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. A single bomb destroyed an entire city. 80,000 people died instantly. Japan didn't surrender. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. World War II was over. 70 to 85 million people had died, the deadliest conflict in human history. And America emerged from it all as the most powerful nation on Earth, its economy booming while Europe lay in ruins. The largest military in the world, the atomic bomb, the undisputed leader of the free world. But with that power came a new kind of threat, one that didn't involve bombs or bullets, something far more terrifying. That story is part 2. In part 2, the Cold War, civil rights, Vietnam, the moon landing, Watergate, 9/11, and everything that brought America to where it is today. Subscribe so you don't miss it. See you there.